Somewhere deep in the woods of Newtown, Connecticut, during the cold autumn of the late 1970s, hikers stumbled upon something that would draw the attention of the most famous paranormal investigators in America. What they found was not the remnants of a campsite or the typical debris of teenagers gathering in the forest. Instead, they discovered a clearing marked by symbols carved into the bark of surrounding trees, the ash of repeated fires, and standing at the center of it all, a massive wooden figure towering over 2 meters tall, its surface covered in carved symbols that seemed to watch anyone who entered that space. This was not art. This was not a prank. This was an idol used for purposes that the local authorities could not fully comprehend, but instinctively knew required expertise beyond their own. The calls went out to Ed and Lorraine Warren, the Monroe, Connecticut couple who had spent decades investigating the darkest corners of supernatural activity across New England and beyond. Newtown sits just a few miles from Monroe, placing it squarely within the geographical territory the Warrens knew intimately and watched carefully. During the 1970s and 80s, a disturbing cultural current had begun flowing through many American communities, drawing young people toward occult practices that previous generations had regarded with either disbelief or extreme caution. What made this period particularly dangerous in the assessment of researchers like the Warrens was not simply that interest in the occult had increased, but that this interest was pursued without any corresponding understanding of the spiritual realities being invoked. Young people drawn to the aesthetic rebellion of satanic imagery and ritual practice were conducting ceremonies pulled from books and passed along through word of mouth, genuinely attempting to make contact with forces they did not believe were real. The Warrens had encountered this pattern repeatedly across their investigations, and each time the outcome followed a similar trajectory. The participants would perform rituals as acts of theatrical defiance, only to discover that the entities they had invited were not symbols or psychological projections, but actual presences that responded to invitation and did not require permission to remain once the door had been opened. The reports that eventually reached Ed and Lorraine Warren came from multiple independent sources, which immediately signaled to them that what was happening in the Newtown woods was not isolated or exaggerated. Local residents who used the forest trails for recreation had found the ritual sites and reported them to authorities. A law enforcement contact who knew of the Warrens' work reached out for their assessment of whether the sites represented anything beyond criminal mischief. Most significantly, at least one young person who had participated in the ceremonies came forward seeking help, describing experiences following their involvement that they could neither explain nor escape. When Ed Warren examined the reports and photographs taken at the sites, his decades of study in demonology and occult practice allowed him to identify specific patterns. The arrangement of the clearing, the types of symbols carved into the trees, the positioning of the idol, and the evidence of repeated ceremonial fires all indicated something far more organized and sustained than teenage experimentation. This was invocatory practice, deliberate and repeated, conducted by individuals who had either researched these methods or been taught them, and carried out over a period long enough to establish the site as a fixed location of spiritual activity. When Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived at the primary ritual site, accompanied by members of their New England Society for Psychic Research team, Lorraine's response was immediate and visceral. Lorraine Warren was a clairvoyant whose sensitivity to spiritual atmospheres had been documented across hundreds of investigations, and she described the Newtown clearing as one of the most spiritually agitated outdoor locations she had ever encountered. Unlike residual hauntings, where the energy present was essentially a recording replaying without intelligence or intent, the atmosphere at the Newtown site felt actively hostile to her. She described it as a location that had been conditioned through repeated ritual to receive and hold a specific kind of presence, and that presence resisted anyone arriving with contrary spiritual intention. Ed Warren moved through the clearing with his camera and documentation equipment, recording every detail of the idol and the surrounding evidence. The idol itself was crudely but purposefully carved, its features exaggerated and grotesque, and its surface covered with symbols that Ed recognized from his extensive study of adversarial occult traditions. At the base of the idol, the concentration of ash and the arrangement of burned materials indicated that this figure had served as the focal point for ceremonies conducted with fire, likely involving spoken invocations and offerings. The danger that Ed Warren identified at the Newtown site operated on two distinct levels. The first and most immediate danger was to the young people who had participated in these rituals. By engaging in sustained invocatory ceremonialism, these individuals had opened themselves spiritually to forces that required significant theological understanding and spiritual authority to manage safely. The Warrens had seen this outcome countless times in their career. People drawn to occult practice for reasons of curiosity or rebellion would perform rituals without believing the entities they invoked were real, only to find themselves experiencing phenomena they could not stop or control. Nightmares, oppressive presences in their homes, personality changes, and in the most severe cases, symptoms consistent with what the Catholic Church defined as demonic oppression or infestation. The second level of danger pertained to the location itself. Lorraine's assessment, grounded in the theological framework that guided all of the Warrens' work, was that sustained invocatory practice at a fixed location created a persistent spiritual focal point. Even after the original participants stopped coming to the site, the clearing would continue to function as an attractor for adversarial entities. The large idol, having served as the physical and symbolic center of these ceremonies, was in the Warrens' view a repository of accumulated dark spiritual energy that could not simply be left in place. The decision was made to remove the idol and to conduct a formal spiritual cleansing of the site. This work required coordination with Catholic clergy, as the Warrens operated within a framework that understood the authority to confront and banish demonic presence as residing properly with the Church. A priest who had worked with Ed Warren on previous Connecticut cases agreed to perform the blessing, bringing both his formal clerical authority and his personal conviction to the ceremony. The removal operation took place over multiple visits spread across several weeks. On the day of the primary blessing, those present included Ed and Lorraine Warren, the officiating priest, and several members of the NESBR team who served as witnesses and assistants. Lorraine described the atmosphere during the blessing as one of sustained resistance. The prayers seemed to meet an opposing force, a pressure that pushed back against the words being spoken. Ed Warren documented several physical anomalies during the ceremony. Wind movement occurred in patterns that could not be explained by natural conditions, concentrated specifically around the area where the idol had stood. The temperature in that immediate area dropped noticeably despite the surrounding forest remaining at ambient temperature. Sounds emerged from the treeline that all present agreed were not consistent with any wildlife native to Connecticut. The priest continued the blessing without interruption, and as the ritual prayers concluded, everyone present reported a sudden and dramatic shift in the atmosphere. The oppressive quality that had defined the clearing lifted, and the space took on the ordinary character of a normal woodland area. The idol was carefully transporting to the Warren Occult Museum in Monroe, where it was placed in a section of the collection reserved for objects deemed too dangerous to remain in general circulation. The Newtown satanic idol became one of the most striking pieces in the Warren collection, a 2-meter-tall physical testament to the reality of what the Warrens spent their lives investigating. Ed Warren used the case extensively in his lectures at universities and police academies, presenting it as a concrete example of what could happen when occult practice was pursued without understanding or spiritual protection. The case illustrated a dimension of the Warren work that went beyond responding to families experiencing hauntings. It showed their willingness to proactively identify and remediate locations where human activity had created conditions hospitable to demonic presence. Lorraine Warren continued to speak about the Newtown investigation in interviews for the rest of her life, returning to it as an example of how adversarial spiritual forces were not only the product of spontaneous haunting, but could be deliberately cultivated through ritual practice, with consequences that extended far beyond the individuals who had conducted the ceremonies. The idol remains in the Warren Occult Museum to this day, contained and consecrated, a physical reminder that some doors once opened require more than human effort to close again. Hashtags: Number Ed and Lorraine Warren, Number Warren Occult Museum, Number Satanic Idol, Number Newtown, Connecticut, Number Paranormal Investigation, Number Demonic Haunting, Number Occult Rituals, Number True Horror, Number Vanishing Roads, Number Haunted Artifacts, Number Warren Case Files, Number Supernatural History, Number Dark History, Number Paranormal Documentary, Number Creepy But True. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented paranormal case files. All events reference real investigations by Ed and Lorraine Warren.